Can you hear me now?
All right, let's try that again. The people at home, hello. We had a little microphone outage, which has now been fixed. So let's start from the beginning. Groovy, far out. Peace to all of my brothers and sisters in our congregation. Thank you for showing up on this wonderful rainy fall day. And my name is Monica Pilman. I am currently serving as a deacon of this congregation. I'm the one in the middle, the second most senior deacon. Just have a few announcements from the pulpit for us this morning. We found a wedding ring here in the congregation, here in the sanctuary, in the back pew over there. And if you are someone who lost it, then you need to talk to Reverend Lara or to Cindy Malley about it. Okay, I want to welcome a new member to our Worship Associates team. These are people who tirelessly volunteer to keep our service running smoothly up here every Sunday, except for this one little bobble we had today. But that's the people who set this place up for a concert on Saturday night. Just missed one little thing. So we can forgive them. What else? Oh, yes, there's always a need in religious education for more volunteers to help Thea with the children. And there's Thea right there. You should go talk to her. And we need people who are good at reading stories. I'm thinking of some of you who've done it in the past. You're quite good at it. You should volunteer. So other than that, please refer to your community matters. There's all kinds of interesting things going on. Today is a Share the Plate service. The recipient will be the League of Women Voters Education Fund, which is just so appropriate for this time of the year with the midterms. So welcome everyone here, welcome everyone at home, and have a good church. Have a good Sunday.
Childhood remembrances are always a drag if you're black. You always remember things like living in Woodlawn with no inside toilet. And if you become famous or something, they never let you talk about how happy you were to have your mother all to yourself and how good the water felt when you got your bath from one of those big tubs that folk in Chicago barbecue in. And somehow when you talk about home, it never gets across how much you understood their feelings as the whole family attended meetings about Hollydale. And even though you remember, your biographers never understand your father's pain as he sells his stock and another dream goes. And though you're poor, it isn't poverty that concerns you. And though they fought a lot, it isn't your father's drinking that makes any difference, but only that everybody is together and you and your sister have happy birthdays and very good Christmases. And I really hope no white person ever has cause to write about me because they never understand black love is black wealth. And they'll probably talk about my hard childhood and never understand that all the while I was quite happy. The words of Giovanni from 1968. Let us worship. I'd like to call Natalie up to light our chalice this morning. Is that a surprise? Oh, okay. Happy surprise. And as Natalie lights our chalice, please join with me in saying the words of our covenant. Love is the spirit of this church, and service its law. This is our great covenant, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another. You got it? All right, thank you. Well, good morning. I join with Monica in welcoming you here to First Church Unitarian in Littleton, Massachusetts on a rainy day, but a nice day. My name is Lara Hoke, pronouns she, her, and I'm so happy and lucky to be the minister serving this incredible congregation. Yeah, it is an incredible congregation. So, thank you. Golly, shucks. So we are multi-platform, as we always are, and hello to people with us online this morning. And I like to remind us, people who are here, to not worry if they have children or babies with them that make noises, because we all make noises, and we're just happy everyone is here. Today, we are going to think about the spirituality of the 1960s, continuing on in a series. We talked about the 50s last month. And you might wonder why I'm doing this, going through these decades. Briefly, the reason is we're starting to really get intentional thinking about our future, and sometimes it helps to kind of take a look back and take stock and think about that. So that's kind of my reasoning. Plus, it's fun, let's be honest. Speaking of which, time for our opening song, and you'll see the lyrics on an insert and also on the screens. The song is Dancin' in the Streets, and I invite you to rise in body or spirit.
There. Can you hear me? Woohoo! So this is a story, believe it or not, from the 1960s that we still read in elementary schools. And one thing I wanted to share before I start is if you were to walk down the stairs, you would see a big board that says, welcome. And it also says, what are you thankful for? And there's little stickies there for everyone to share this month, things they're thankful for. So there's little pens hanging up and little stickies, and feel free to share. You guys know this story, I bet. Swimmy. You know it. A happy school of little fish lived in the corner of the sea somewhere. They were all red. Only one of them was as black as a mussel shell. He swam faster than his brothers and sisters. His name was Swimmy. One day, a tuna fish, swift, fierce, and very hungry, came darting through the waves. In one gulp, he swallowed all the little red fish. Only Swimmy escaped. He swam away in the deep, wet world. He was scared and sad and lonely. But the sea was full of wonderful creatures, and as he swam from marvel to marvel, Swimmy was happy again. He saw a Medusa made of rainbow jelly, a lobster who walked about like a water-moving machine, strange fish pulled by an invisible thread, a forest of seaweed growing from sugar candy rocks, an eel whose tail was almost too far away to remember, and sea anemones who looked like pink palm trees swaying in the wind. Then, hidden in the dark shade of rocks and weeds, he saw a school of little fish, just like his own. "Let's go and swim and play and see things," he said happily. "We can't," said the little red fish. "The big fish will eat us all." "But you can't just lie here," said Swimmy. "We must think of something." Swimmy thought and thought and thought, and then suddenly he said, "I have it. We're going to swim all together like the biggest fish in the sea." He taught them to swim close together, each in his own place. And when they had learned to swim like one giant fish, he said, "I'll be the eye." And so they swam in the cool morning water and in the midday sun and chased away big fish. Okay, we're going to stay for the anthem and then we'll go. And Lainey, you're going to carry it, right? Okay. She wants to.
Hello? Can you hear? Come gather around, people, wherever you roam, and admit that the waters around you have grown, and accept it that soon you'll be drenched to the bone. If your time to you is worth saving, then you better start swimming or you'll sink like a stone, for the times they are a-Changin'. Come writers and critics who prophesize with your pens, and keep your eyes wide, the chance won't come again. And don't speak too soon, for the wheel's still in spin, and there's no telling who that it's naming. For the loser now may be later to win, for the times they are a-Changin'. Come, senators, congressmen, please heed the call. Don't stand in the doorways, don't block up the hall. For those who get hurt will be those who have stalled. There's a battle outside and it's raging. It'll soon shake your windows and rattle your walls, for the times they are a-Changin'. Come, mothers and fathers throughout the land, and don't criticize what you don't understand. Your sons and your daughters are beyond your command. Your old road is rapidly aging. Please get out of the new one if you can't lend a hand, 'cause the times, they are a-Changin'. The line it is drawn, the curse it is cast. The slow one now will later be last, as the present now will later be past. The order is rapidly fading, and the first one now will later be last, 'cause the times, they are a-Changin'.
Good morning. I'm Linda Kaler, and it is my honor to introduce our Share the Plate speaker this morning, because it is a cause that is very dear to me, voting. It's also the reason why I'm going to smile all day today. Enough about me. Our guest speaker today is Janet Adachi, who is a member of the League of Women Voters. Janet grew up in Sudbury and now lives in Acton, where she is very active in Acton committee work. Janet's mother, I love this, Janet's mother was a member of the League of Women Voters, and Janet was inspired to join 12 years ago. So now I'll turn it over to Janet to tell us more about her work with the League in the Acton area.
This is great. This is a little platform for short people like me. So I'm used to, hello, can you see me? Sorry, no, I'm more used to that. But good morning, everyone, and thank you for having me. And special thanks to Linda for the lovely introduction, and also to Monica Pilman, who kind of worked with Linda to kind of guide me through the process for today, and to Reverend Hoke. Thank you. As Linda said, I've lived in Acton since 1997, actually. I joined the League in Acton area, the Acton Area League, belatedly when I was running for the Select Board of Acton, and realized during the forum, the candidates forum that the Acton League hosted, that my mother had been a member of the League in Sudbury decades before, and I was reminded of how much at that time I had appreciated the League's information for voters about issues, because it was around that time that the 18-year-olds got the vote,
in 1972, and I was in college, so I was able to take advantage of the right to vote to cast my very first presidential vote for George McGovern, who was running against Richard Nixon. And all I'll say about that vote is that George McGovern won Massachusetts, okay? Anyhow, I'm currently part of the Acton Area League's 3-person executive committee, which runs the, board, which we call the steering committee, which runs the Acton Area League. Just a few words about the League of Women Voters mission. I'll read it. It may be a little dry, but I want to emphasize something in it. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan political organization that encourages informed and active participation in government, works to increase understanding of major public policy issues, and influences public policy through education and advocacy. That is from the National League's website. The League does insist that it is a nonpartisan organization, although lately I think some people of one party are assuming that League of Women Voters organizations are partisan because the League often, through a lot of study and discussion and consensus building among members, takes positions that often overlap with the positions of the Democrats. But it's a completely different process. It's in the way that I often vote and have opinions that are overlap with Democrats' opinions, although I'm an independent voter, but I get to my positions through an independent process that doesn't have anything to do with where the party stands. So nonpartisan in any event for the League in that it doesn't endorse political parties, partisan political parties, or candidates. But as I said, it does take positions and it advocates for them. And the positions are through an independent process that is nonpartisan. So when people, well, you may not be talking to people who claim that the League is partisan, but if they say that, you can sort of point out that there's a very rigorous process for taking positions and advocating for them that is not partisan. The League actually is one organization, but it has 3 different levels. There's a national organization, there's a state organization, and then there's a local organization, which is probably what most people think of when they think of the League of Women Voters. There are 50 state organizations and over 700 local organizations, which can encompass one municipality, multiple municipalities, and I suppose in very rural areas where there aren't enough people to form a local organization, maybe the only organization is the state organization. Now, there are some local and state positions that can rise to the level of the National League if people feel strongly at the local or state level that the National League should take a position on them. So there is some autonomy at the local level. It's not as if you're eclipsed by the National League. In fact, to the contrary, I think a lot of the guts and the real work is at the state and local level. Let's see. All genders are welcome. The word women is in the name, and it will probably stay there for a while, but we welcome everybody. We have a few male members in our Acton Area League, although they seem to be mostly the husbands of women who are members. I haven't worked on my husband yet to join. He's busy with other things, so I want him to do those other things. And we actually join at the local level. It's a nationally based organization, but everybody joins at the local level, pays dues at the local level, some of which flow up to the state and national organizations. Now that's going to change in a couple of years. We're going to join and renew at the national level, pay dues, whatever we feel like paying. If you can't afford to pay so much, they'll take that. If you feel very generous, you can pay a lot more. But it's supposed to flow down to the state and local levels and be more beneficial to the state and local organizations than the current arrangement is. And we'll see. A little bit about the Acton Area League. The organization started in 1961. It was originally just Acton, but it expanded to include other communities, including Littleton. And the other communities aside from Acton and Littleton are Boxborough, Maynard, Stowe, and Hudson most recently. So there's growing participation of Boxborough and Hudson members. The 90 members in the Acton Area League are still more than half Acton members, but we'd welcome more members from everywhere, and we'd especially welcome more members from Littleton. I think we have one member, and she's busy with some other organizations. But in case you're interested, our website is lwv-actonarea.org. Or if you would like to email me to have me direct your question to the right source, ask Monica or Linda for my email address. I won't recite it right here because I've already given you more information with the website than you need. Some of the activities that we engage in at the local level are probably typical of many leagues. There are programs to educate voters and the general public, programs to educate league members, and also programs that do both. So candidate forums is a big one for a lot of leagues. In this fall, the Acton Area and the Concord-Carlisle Leagues co-sponsored an in-person forum in Concord for the candidates running for the 14th Middlesex State Representative seat, which encompasses parts of Acton and Concord as well as all of Carlisle and Chelmsford. And next spring, I'm assuming that we're going to have co-sponsor or host some local candidate forums for the select board and school committee candidates. It could be in person, could be remote, could be hybrid. Thanks to the pandemic, everybody has gotten very good at using all the technology to Zoom things and have uploaded videos and all the rest of it. So we have more options and more versatility in what we choose to put on. There are also public forums that we tend to host, and they're usually timely topics. We had a series about journalism. This was a few years ago, before the recent concern about the loss of local newspaper coverage, which seems to be a problem everywhere in our area. There was a panel on water quality in the wake of increasing concerns about PFAS, which is an acronym for polyfluoroalkyl substances. I had to write that down because I wasn't going to remember it. There was a virtual panel about local policing practices in the wake of 2020, and that panel featured police chiefs from most of the 6-member towns. And as I said, this year, maybe there will be a program about the loss of independent local news coverage. Last month, and this is not an Acton area sponsored program, last month Acton area members participated in a state league program partnering with the local Common Cause organization to train league members on how to monitor polling locations in areas that had been a problem in Massachusetts. I think this was nationwide, and there was a local program in Massachusetts as well. A number of the league members went through the training. I did too, but I couldn't fit in monitoring into my schedule, but a number of people did 3-hour shifts poll watching and really found it to be very rewarding because you're not just watching for suspicious things, you're helping people who seem a little lost and they want information about what am I going to do with my mail-in ballot that I have with me. Well, you're supposed to go to the drop-off box for the ballots. You're not supposed to take it to the polling location. Things like that that are increasingly issues because now we have all these different ways of voting and different days when we can vote. Other activities, we do studies. These are more member-focused. There are issues on which the National League wants input from the state and local leagues, so we've done studies locally that you send your consensus up to the state level, which sends the consensus up to the national level, and sometimes that results in the adoption of an official national position. But we've had studies about charter schools, which I know in Massachusetts are kind of controversial because they take public funding away from the municipalities that have public schools. We've done a study on ballot questions, how they get there, and then also how to amend the U.S. Constitution, which I know about because I trained as a lawyer. I wouldn't recommend it to a lot of people, and I think that's why there's an effort in some states to sign on to an agreement to deal with the problem of the Electoral College and the fact that it doesn't work fairly. They're trying to find an agreement, multi-state agreement, where all these states will agree to have all of their votes go to the real winner as opposed to whatever is happening right now with the Electoral College. There also is fun stuff, what I call fun stuff. There's a book club whose selections tend to focus on really very popular current issues. There's an annual scarecrow contest at a local farm in Acton that raises money for the National Alliance on Mental Illness. The Acton area's entry this year, we haven't necessarily done very well in past years, too serious, but this year's entry was Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who had kind of a creepily realistic appearance. A trained artist was the ringer and did the face. And so she's standing there, and you just do feel as if she's back. It was nice. It was nice to have her back, albeit in that form. So, and that's it. Thank you for your time and for supporting the League's Education Fund, and most of all for being engaged and, I know, informed voters. So, thank you.
So for those of you here in the sanctuary, any loose cash in the plates will go to the League of Women's Voters Education Fund, or you can write a check made out to the League of Women's Voters Education Fund. For those of you watching online, with us online, you can either go to the website lwv.org and click on Donate, or you can send your check in to P.O. Box 96837, Washington, D.C., 20090. This morning's offering will now be given and received in grateful appreciation. Please join with me in the words of our community response. We are grateful for the opportunity to give and serve, and grateful for the gifts we have received. May this affirm the ministries of our church community, both within and beyond these walls. Most weeks, this congregation shares a special time to feel again our connections to one another and that which we consider holy. And it's in this spirit that we share in the candles of caring. If you have an important joy or concern that you would like to share with this gathered, beloved community, we ask that you, if you're in the sanctuary, raise your hand high enough that we can see it, and we'll come around to you with a microphone. And briefly let us know your name and how we might direct our thoughts, prayers, and healing wishes. We'll light a candle up front. If you're with us on Zoom, you can raise your hand in the reactions area, and we'll call on you. Are there any candles of caring this morning? Please join with me in the spirit of meditation or prayer. Once again, we have come together in love and trust, sharing those cares dearest to us with this gathered, beloved community. Let us hold in our thoughts and prayers those joys and concerns that were spoken aloud, as well as those that remain unspoken, as we share together in a time of sacred silence. Amen, and blessed be. How can we begin to encapsulate the 1960s in the United States of America in the length of a sermon? We can't really. But last month we talked about the 50s, as I said, and the 60s are even richer in their spiritual, theological, and philosophical messages. So I'm going to try to hit many of the main themes and try to tease out a few of the things that might be less obvious at first glance. So, starting at the beginning, when did the cultural decade of the 60s start? As I noted last time, the cultural decades don't really start at January 1st, 1960 stroke of midnight. This is actually the most famous example of a cultural decade starting. The cultural critics mostly agree. They think of the 60s as starting in November 1963 with the assassination of John F. Kennedy, followed just a few months later by the Beatles appearing on Ed Sullivan, February 64. The first thing that jumps out to me about the 1960s is the coming of the younger generation. At Kennedy's 1961 inauguration, he talked about the torch being passed to a new generation, a younger generation. And yes, the power was being passed to his generation, the GI generation. He was the first of a string of GI generation presidents. But the cultural torch was being passed to the even younger baby boomer generation. The baby boomers really started to dominate the culture of the country. And the youth culture was a dominant force throughout the 1960s. And as Bob Dylan put it, and as you heard so beautifully earlier, the times they were a-Changin'. Some people are cynical about the youth culture of the 60s, seeing it as an excuse to party. People might think of youth from the 60s and think of free love and drugs and loud music. The phrase after the fact was sex, drugs, and rock and roll, sort of a hedonistic vibe. And I don't doubt that there was some hedonism in the 60s. Every era has its version of that. But what stands out to me about the 60s is how seriously everything was taken. There was so much intentionality about things, so much intensity. It wasn't just that people were having what you might call casual sex. It was intentional free love in many cases, a different way of thinking about relationships and the possessive property-like implications that can creep into marriage or conventional monogamous relationships. And it wasn't just recreational drugs purely for kicks. In many cases, it was intentional mind expansion with drugs like LSD or peyote and what have you. A kind of communion with the universe was desired. And it wasn't just any loud rock and roll music. Okay, there was some silly pop music in the 60s, but lots of 60s rock and roll was unprecedented in its expansive experimentation, like the sitars and Indian musical instruments you started to hear, and non-musical sounds that you started to hear incorporated onto albums. And the topics of rock and roll songs went beyond the 50s rock and roll staples of cars and romance to, you name it, songs about alienation and discontent, songs about creating a whole new way of living, songs about social injustice, and so on. A lot of the music was meant for you to sit down and really listen to it. The lyrics started to really matter, and you started to have lyric sheets in your albums. To use the Beatles as an example, their first United States album release contained the song I Want to Hold Your Hand, which we heard as our prelude. But by 1970, just 6 years later, their last US album release contained the song Across the Universe, including a reference to Guru Deva. That's quite a 6-year progression, think about it. And the Beatles' lightning-fast trajectory of artistic and creative and consciousness expansion almost magically mirrors the 1960s. In the 1960s, for the most part, the United States post-World War II prosperity continued. There was still a sizable, healthy middle class. The teenagers of the 60s, certainly in the white suburbs, had it financially easier than their parents in many cases. And this was part of the setup for that famous generational divide between the older generations, who knew poverty and sacrifice, and the younger generation, who knew mostly prosperity. And at least in part, that paved the way for hippie culture. Because when all of your basic needs are met, and you aren't worried about having clothing and shelter, you don't know the fear of not knowing where your next meal is coming from, as some people experienced in the Great Depression and so on, you think about other things. It's like the mid-60s composition by Jerry Leiber and Mike Stoller, made famous by Peggy Lee in 1969. Is that all there is? The hippies, at least, thought there was something more, something better than the bland 50s life of ease. It's hard to know numbers. There probably are not great statistics on this. It's not clear how many true hippies there were. Lots of people adopted some of the look, some of the talk, the slang. But the number of people who adopted a full-on hippie lifestyle was probably fairly small. But their influence was disproportionately big. Their impact was great. Yes, they had a certain way of dressing and talking, but real hippies had a whole philosophy that was profoundly important. Hippies, full-on hippies, rejected middle-class ideology. In so doing, they rejected so-called Protestant work ethic. Ultimately, they rejected capitalism, materialism, militarism, and imperialism. It was no accident that hippies had hair like Jesus wore it. Their values were very much in line with what theologians might call New Testament ethics, the ethics of Jesus. Their version of the American dream was spiritual, not material. It was a huge shift in values. It was, in brief, countercultural. They were anti-establishment, and they didn't trust anyone over 30. A quick note on the fashions of the 60s, since many of them were hippie-inspired. What were they? What did they tell us? I see a few themes. Long hair, of course, was in. There were love beads and tie-dye. I see some great tie-dye out there in the sanctuary today. Bell bottoms, ponchos, flowers and feathers in the hair. And all of these pointed to rejecting the old button-down values and rejecting militarism and embracing a new aesthetic. As the decade went on, and as Black Power and Black Pride movements grew, African dashiki shirts became popular and big afros became in fashion. And this points in part to a rejection of white supremacy culture and European beauty and fashion standards. Similarly, other non-European cultures were embraced, and fashions inspired by Native Americans and India, Mexico, and other cultures became more popular. It was, you could see it in part as an attempt to, as we might say today, decenter whiteness, though at times it certainly bordered on cultural appropriation. Always a fine line. In a way, the core hippie values, though they grew out of a place of white privilege to some extent, remind me of the values of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. King came to prominence in the 50s, leading the civil rights movement, working for equal rights for Black Americans. It was in the 60s when some of the greatest successes actually came to pass, like the Civil Rights Act of '64 and the Voting Rights Act of '65. And then as the 60s progressed, King's consciousness expanded too, in a way. He saw that you can't completely separate the evils of racism from the evils of poverty and the evils of militarism. In 1967, King declared that the three evils of society were racism, poverty, and militarism. After all, Black Americans were not only being denied civil rights, they were also more likely to live in poverty, and they were more likely to be drafted and go to war. It's all connected. And so King, as he so often was, he was prescient in discerning the importance of what we would now call the intersectionality of justice issues. The backdrop for both King and the hippies in rejecting militarism was, of course, the horrible elephant in the room of the decade, the Vietnam War. In 1964, the so-called Gulf of Tonkin incident became an excuse for President Lyndon Johnson really to escalate the US war in Vietnam almost at will. In retrospect, it seems the whole incident was largely a lie, a bit like the weapons of mass destruction that got us into war with Iraq almost 20 years ago. Supposedly fighting in Vietnam was necessary to stop the tide of communism, but the United States was deeply divided over the war. More and more Americans began to doubt the war, began to doubt that war with this small, beautiful country so far away was really necessary to protect the American way of life. By 1968, public opinion had turned against the war. the anti-war movement, which had been much smaller earlier on, started to become enormous. Youth, and particularly college campuses, became the sites of huge anti-war demonstrations. Now, on the surface, it seems to bring up a pacifistic bent to the 60s, and absolutely that was in there. There were sincere pacifists among the activists, certainly including those who became conscientious objectors. But one thing that sometimes gets lost is that it was largely framed as an anti-war movement, as opposed to, say, a pro-peace movement. Perhaps that's just semantics, but it fits with much of 60s ideology as being in opposition to anti-authority, anti-establishment, counterculture, anti-war. In a sense, looking at the spirituality of the 60s, I have to admit it reminds me just a little bit of a trap that sometimes Unitarian Universalism falls into, where sometimes we have an easier time articulating what we do not believe as opposed to what we do believe. And that's something I like about our 7 principles. As imperfect as they are, they ask us to affirm things. And yes, sometimes 60s movements were framed in an affirmative way, like Black Power, like Flower Power, but there's a certain anti-streak that sometimes appears there, dominant, and sometimes in our own faith tradition. This makes some sense in that modern Unitarian Universalism certainly shows a cultural imprint from the 60s, arguably more than any other decade. Not that that's all bad. In many ways, it's a good thing. Certainly, the Vietnam War and the resulting anti-war movement spelled the downfall of Johnson's presidency. He didn't seek re-election in 1968. After 1967, the Summer of Love, the year 1968 turned out to be a very hard year for this country. On April 4th, 1968, after becoming more radicalized, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated and died just 39 years old. On June 6, 1968, Robert Kennedy was assassinated right after winning the Democratic primary in California. My mother was actually pregnant with me for both of those assassinations. And so the 60s will, among other things, always be associated with assassinations. It started with John F. Kennedy in 63, and Malcolm X in 65, and Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy in 68. You could say, to use the words of prophet Isaiah in the Hebrew scriptures, that these men had all come to believe in turning swords into plowshares, or to use Christian New Testament language, they had all come to see that if you live by the sword, you die by the sword. And yet their efforts to prevent war and advocate for compassion and peace met such violent ends. Of course, that was true for Jesus himself. And so the 60s also contained an element of martyrdom that stands out. The 60s had their contradictions. In spite of the 60s being such a deep decade with some profound music and really insightful cultural criticism, the 60s was also a decade with probably some of the most ridiculous television shows in history. You had Gilligan's Island, I Dream of Jeannie, The Munsters, Green Acres, The Flying Nun. What? Pretty silly stuff for such a serious decade. On a more somber note, you had the contradiction of this groovy decade with hippies and free love, and then you had the 1968 election of someone as square an establishment as Richard Nixon. How curious that a decade as idealistic and utopian as the 60s would end with the realpolitik and dystopia of the Nixon administration. For the sake of time, I'll note briefly that the 60s had incredible highs and lows. That's partly why they're so vivid for people who lived through them. We've already talked about some of them. To mention just a few more, In 1969, there was the astounding success, really, of Woodstock, an outdoor concert that was overflowing with muddy and, in some ways, tough conditions, and yet somehow it was 3 days of music and peace, which really is remarkable. That same year, there was, of course, the incredible accomplishment of safely landing and returning to Earth human beings, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, on the moon. Really amazing. And yet, in addition to war and assassinations, the 60s had some very tough events. Some will remember a time of urban unrest and riots, like the 1965 Watts riots in California, 67 riots in Newark and Detroit. 43 people died in Detroit. And then riots breaking out in more than 100 cities in the United States after the assassination of Martin Luther King. And in those riots, more than 50 people died. And then, of course, there was the 1968 Democratic Convention in Chicago and the violence that ensued. Just a few examples. Riots are, as Martin Luther King famously put it, the language of the unheard. The words of Psalm 113 come to mind. How long, O Lord? How long must I wrestle with my thoughts and day after day have sorrow in my heart? In closing, though there were some smaller burgeoning justice movements in the 60s, like the Seeds for Women's Lib with Betty Friedan's 63 Feminine Mystique, and the Seeds for Gay and later LGBTQ plus liberation with the Stonewall riots in 1969, it's hard to miss that the two biggest major power struggles for justice in the 60s were against the war and for Black liberation, and that those two struggles were of epic biblical proportions. You see it and hear it in the songs that were sung in the civil rights movement, many of which were the great old African-American spirituals. And you had some contemporary songs written in a gospel style, like People Get Ready by Curtis Mayfield, a song he wrote after hearing King's I Have a Dream speech in the March on Washington. In addition to the 60s theme of heading toward a new and better place, there are hints of redemption and a suggestion to leave your baggage behind, get ready for a better world. We're heading to the promised land. The 60s are, incredibly, more than a half a century behind us now. But we feel their impact every day. May we continue to learn from the hard lessons. May we continue to grow, expand, and explore in that amazing spirit of love from the 60s, that another world is possible. May it be so. Blessed be, and amen. And you didn't think Molly and I would let you get out of here without singing some Beatles. So our closing song is All You Need Is Love, and the words will be on the screens and also in your handout insert. I invite you to rise in body or spirit. closing words. If you're comfortable and the person next to you is comfortable, you can hold hands. Otherwise, you could touch elbows, or if you wish, simply put your hands out and feel the energy between us and the energy between us and the people with us online. And our closing words this morning are actually lyrics from Joni Mitchell. Then I can walk beside you. I have come here to lose the smog, and I feel to be a cog in something turning. Well, maybe it's just the time of year, or maybe it's the time of man. I don't know who I am, but you know life is for learning. We are stardust, we are golden, and we've got to get ourselves back to the garden. May it be so. Blessed be. Go in peace.
Peace, love, and understanding to everyone at home. Have a great Sunday. So ends this broadcast.